Welcome to my Python loop video. Now, loops in Python are something that repeat over and over until a particular condition is satisfied. Now, in Python, there are two main types of loops, while loops and for loops. While loops are the more simple type of loop because it'll just keep running until either its condition is set to false, or you can use the break command in the loop. If you don't use either of these, the while loop will continue on forever, and just to write a while loop, you write while, and then either a little conditional statement. You don't write the if or the elif. You just write like 1 greater than 6, and then you write while before that. Or just write true, which will keep it going on forever. And then you just write a colon, then enter, and then type all the code below it while it's tabbed in. Now, you can end a while loop through two ways, just like I said. You can either type break in the loop, and when you do that, it'll just end it when you reach it, or the condition set by it can be false. To put something in the loop, you just make sure it's indented below it. Next, we have the for loops. For loops are like while loops, but do not need to have a true condition to loop through. The loop do not need to be true for them to loop. And what they do is that they're usually set to only iterate themselves, or loop iterates the proper term, a certain number of times using a few different methods. Now, to write a for loop, you write for, then x, then you write in, and then either range, or if you want, a variable that it will list, and then a colon, and below it you do all the indented code below. Make sure everything below the loop is indented. What it will do is if you do it like this, what it'll do is it'll iterate all the string name in the variable after it. So basically all the different string words in that variable you put in, the for in, for x in, then that variable, all in the variable after the in. It will list all those, but it won't work with numbers. I tried, it just gives you an error. Now this is useful if you want to display some text easily, but it's not as useful as if you were using a for loop with the range function, which makes it a lot more useful in my opinion, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But yeah, so the basic for loop though is not very useful in my humble opinion. Now we have a bunch of different ways to use loops. Now the first way is to use range, which I just mentioned, which will limit the amount of times a for loop will iterate itself. Now the amount of times the for loop will iterate is set by the programmer, and the way you do this is with the range function. Now the way you use the range function is you start first by typing for, then a variable, then in range, then one bracket, then put the number of times you want that loop to iterate before it stops, and then close the bracket, then put a colon, and then put all the code indented, you know the drill. And what it will do is the loop will iterate the number of times you put in the brackets, and it has to be a number. You can't use a string. Now this is one of the most useful ways to use loops because it can save you a lot of time writing code. Like if you wanted a specific piece of code to run 7 times, instead of writing it 7 times, you just use a for loop. A lot easier. Saves you 7 times the amount of time. And yeah, so yeah, this is basically just a good way to use for loops. Now the next way is to use the break function. Now this is kind of a way, but it's not really a way, but it's something you can do with a loop. Now unlike the range, it works with both loops. And what it'll do is as soon as it's reached and the loop runs it, it'll stop the loop no matter what. And the way you type break is you just type break below the loop and make sure it's indented in the loop so the loop will run it. Now I kind of explained to you how it works, but when you type it in the loop, it will run all the code below it like normal, and it will keep running until it reaches it, and then until it reaches it. Once it does the loop will stop, and yeah. If, for example, it's an if statement though, it will only break if that if statement returns as true. So this is the most useful way to do it. And you can use this function to cancel a loop if you want the loop to end after running a certain amount of commands. But I feel the range function is more effective than this because it's a little more precise and easier to just code. So yeah. Now with both loops, you can use an else statement. In a for loop, it will activate the code below the else statement once the for loop will stop iterating itself, and for a while loop, it will iterate once the condition is set to false. And you can type an else by after you're done typing all the for or while loops code, you write else, then make sure it's not indented, then a colon, then beneath the else statement, write whatever code you want after the loop completes itself that you want to run. Make sure the else is unindented as I just said, and all its code is indented below the else. And this is useful if you want some code to run once the once either your for or while loop's done. Like you could probably do a game over screen with this in a more basic type Python game. That's just one way that you can use. I think it's pretty useful. Now, just like conditional statements, another way you can use loops is a nested loop. And it does not matter what loop combo you can do. You can do whatever one. So you can do a for in a for or a for in a while. It does not matter. And the way the nested loops works is the nested loop will iterate itself every time the outside loop iterates itself. And there's really not much more to it. Now to write a nested loop, all you have to do is below your loop, indent, then type whatever nested loop you want. That's as simple as that. And nested loops are very useful for a lot of purposes, but a main use is for Pygame game loops in a Pygame game. Because in a Pygame game, you need a while loop that'll keep infinitely running, and then for loops that will look for specific things to run. Like, for example, key pressing, which is in my game a lot. Or if there's a game over screen, it'll run that. Now next, we have a statement called continue, which you can also use in both loops. What continue does is that when it reaches a continue statement through either it just being reached, like normally scrolling down through code and then it runs it, or in a if statement that returns true, what it will do is it'll stop the loop's current iteration and then reset and start from the beginning of the loop again. And you write continue by just typing the word continue in a line by its own. The location where you type it matters because once it's ran by your code, it'll skip the rest of the loop and it'll skip the rest of your loop and then iterate again. Now the main use for continue is usually putting it in an if statement and if it's true, it'll skip the loop and try again because then the continue, because without that, the continue would probably keep going no matter what in a while loop. Maybe in a for loop. I haven't tested that. I think I want to, but I think it'd go on forever in a for loop because it just keep iterating. But yeah, because it wouldn't fully complete it. And now my last way you can use both loops is with the pass statement. Now this is pretty useless because all you do is if you have an empty loop, you just do like for example while true : you need to put something under that or else you'll get an error. So you could just put pass under it and you won't get an error, but it's useless because if you want to keep a line of code like a loop line of code, just comment it. Pretty useless, but I just thought I should mention it. Now onto my game code where I use loops. In my game, I have 2 while loops and a bunch of different for loops. And I'll get onto the for loops in a second. But my first while loop is my main game loop, which keeps looping all the code beneath it in my game because the game needs to keep updating itself. So we have a while loop that keeps all that code running. And my second while loop is the loop that handles all the if statements that transition you from my game start to game over. And this also is a while loop because it's got to keep checking for all 3 of those. And so, yeah. Sorry. Now for my for loops. I have a lot of these, as I just mentioned, and almost all of them are nested. But my first for loop is nested inside the main game. And what it does, it keeps making pipes appearing in my game with it constantly running all the code inside of it while the auto while loop is running. It also creates a list for the pipes when they go off screen. My next nested for loop is also in the main loop, and what it does, it calls the remove pipe list that the last for loop created, and then fully removes the pipes, or a pipe, because it's one at a time. The next nested in the main game loop is a for loop that controls both the exit button and the bird jumping. The for loop is set to always be looking for any E or key E inputs, and if it gets one of the keys, or I hit the Pygame quit button, it will then run the rest of its loop. The next nested for loop is in the main game. Rects the pipes for the earlier loop to spawn in because it's random, so it's got to keep recting random different pipes. And it also handles collision for when you hit one of those pipes. My next for loop is the first one that's no longer in the main game loop, and what it does is it's part of the game start screen, and it's doing the same as the one of the original for loops, as it's always looking for if you hit the Pygame exit button or the backspace button, so it can run the start game code. Now my last for loop is in the game end code, and all it does is looking for the Pygame exit button when you want it to close, and it'll run all the code and use if statements. And yep. Thank you.